The desperate plea Ambassador Velnus stood in the command center of what remained of his people's greatest space station. His three-fingered hands trembled as he watched another star system fall to the Vrek swarm on the holographic display. That made 12 systems lost in just 3 months. 12 worlds that once held billions of his people and their allies, now reduced to silent, harvested rocks floating in space. The Kalteri Coalition had stood for 300 years as a beacon of peace and cooperation among 7 different species. They had built their society on the principles of honor, diplomacy, and measured military response. Their fleets fought with precision and grace, following ancient protocols that ensured minimal casualties and maximum dignity. Wars were supposed to be civilized affairs, settled through tactical superiority and strategic brilliance. The Vrek swarm did not care about any of that. The machines came without warning, without demands, without any attempt at communication. They simply arrived in a system, surrounded every planet and station, and began the harvest. Millions of autonomous war machines worked in perfect coordination, their distributed intelligence making decisions faster than any organic mind could process. They stripped worlds of resources, consumed everything useful, and moved to the next target. The Coalition's military had tried everything. High Admiral Seltros, their greatest tactical mind, had arranged defensive formations that should have been impenetrable. The honor guard of the Tertian Defense Force had challenged the swarm to single combat, as was proper in civilized warfare. The diplomatic corps had broadcast messages in 4,000 languages, seeking any kind of dialogue. The swarm responded by destroying everything in its path. Now Velnus stood in the command center, surrounded by his exhausted staff, and faced the hardest decision of his long life. On the screen before him was a file marked with red warning symbols. The file contained information about a species the Coalition had spent decades trying to avoid. A people they had blocked from their alliance, a race they considered dangerous and barely civilized. Humans. Velnus remembered the first time the Coalition had encountered humanity, 40 years ago. A human exploration vessel had crossed into Coalition space, and the diplomatic teams had been horrified by what they learned. These creatures came from a Class 12 Deathworld, a planet so violent and hostile that most Coalition species would die within hours of landing. Earth had crushing gravity, dangerous weather, aggressive microorganisms, and an ecosystem where everything evolved to kill and eat everything else. Worse, humans had evolved as persistence predators. They hunted by chasing their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They could recover from injuries that would kill most species. They could adapt to environments that should be impossible to survive. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they consumed the dead flesh of other animals for sustenance. The Coalition had established strict borders with human space. Trade was limited. Diplomatic contact was minimal. Several Coalition members had argued that humanity should be quarantined indefinitely, allowed to expand in their own direction, but never permitted into civilized galactic society. But now, with his people facing extinction, Velnus had to consider the unthinkable. He had to ask the humans for help. His chief advisor, an elderly Kalteri named Morvan, approached with slow, tired steps. "Ambassador, the Council has reviewed your proposal. They have approved your mission, though many did so with great reluctance." Velnus nodded slowly. "I understand their hesitation. Asking the humans for help feels like inviting a predator into our home." "Perhaps," Morvan said quietly, "but we are already being devoured. What harm can another predator do?" 3 days later, Velnus arrived at New Arlington, humanity's newest colony world. His small diplomatic shuttle looked fragile and delicate compared to the massive cargo vessels and military ships that filled the orbital space around the planet. Everything about human construction looked heavy and brutal, designed for function rather than elegance. The shuttle docked at the human diplomatic station, and Velnus felt the gravity increase as soon as he stepped through the airlock. It was not crushing. The humans had adjusted it for visiting species, but it was still noticeably heavier than what his body was accustomed to. How did these creatures live in such conditions every day? Captain Jake Morrison waited in the reception area. He was tall, as most humans were, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to track every movement Velnus made. The human wore a simple uniform, dark blue with silver insignia, and he stood with the relaxed posture of someone completely comfortable in their own strength. "Ambassador Velnus," Jake said, his voice deep and steady. "Welcome to New Arlington. I understand you have urgent business to discuss. Velnus tried to keep his voice from shaking. Captain Morrison, I come on behalf of the Kaltri Coalition. We face extinction and we need help. Jake gestured toward a conference room. Please tell me everything. For the next hour, Velnus explained the situation. He showed Jake the data files, the tactical reports, the casualty estimates. He described how the swarm operated, how it overwhelmed systems through sheer numbers, how it seemed immune to every strategy the coalition had attempted. He spoke of the billions already lost and the billions more who would die if the swarm was not stopped. Jake listened without interrupting, his face neutral and professional. When Velnus finished, the human was quiet for a long moment, studying the data on his tablet. You understand, Jake finally said, that the coalition has never been friendly to humanity. Your people have blocked us from trade routes, refused our diplomatic overtures, and made it very clear that you consider us barbaric and dangerous. Velnus felt shame color his facial membranes. Yes, Captain. I am aware of our past actions and I am ashamed of them. But we are desperate. Our military forces have been reduced to scattered remnants. Our worlds are dying. If the swarm is not stopped, the coalition will cease to exist within 6 months. Jake nodded slowly. And what exactly are you asking for? Military advisors? Weapon technology? A few ships to bolster your defenses? We are asking, Velnus said quietly, for whatever help humanity is willing to provide. We know we have no right to ask for anything, given our treatment of your people, but we are begging nonetheless. Jake stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy orbital space beyond. Ambassador, I need to contact Earth Command. This decision is above my authority. I will present your request to Fleet Admiral Linda Hayes. Can you remain here for a few days while we review the situation? Of course, Velnus said. Thank you for hearing our plea. 2 days passed. Velnus spent the time in the guest quarters provided by the human diplomatic station, unable to sleep, constantly checking for messages from home. The news was always bad. Another defense fleet destroyed. Another evacuation fleet lost. Another world going silent. On the 3rd day, Jake returned to the conference room. His expression was serious but not hostile. He carried a data pad and set it on the table between them. Ambassador, Jake said, I have heard back from Fleet Admiral Hayes. Earth Command has reviewed your situation and made a decision. Velnus felt his heart's beating fast. And what have they decided? Humanity remembers every closed border, Jake said quietly. We remember every trade agreement you refused. We remember being called barbaric, dangerous, barely civilized. We remember all of it. Velnus felt his hope dying. They would refuse. Of course they would refuse. Why would they help the people who had treated them with such contempt? But Jake continued. We also remember what it means to face extinction. We know what it's like to stand on the edge of annihilation and fight with everything we have just to survive one more day. Earth taught us that lesson many times over during our evolution. Jake tapped the data pad and a fleet manifest appeared on the screen. Velnus stared at the numbers, unable to believe what he was seeing. Fleet Admiral Hayes is deploying the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, Jake said. 47 warships, including 3 Dreadnought-class vessels. They will arrive in Coalition space within 1 week. Admiral Hayes will assume tactical command of all operations against the Vrex swarm. Velnus felt his legs weaken. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his hands shaking. Captain Morrison, we did not expect such a response. We hoped for perhaps a few ships, some advisors, but this is a full battle fleet. This is what humanity does, Jake said simply. When we commit to something, we commit fully. You ask for help. You're getting it. But why? Velnus asked, confusion and relief mixing in his voice. After how we treated your people, why would you send so much? Jake's expression softened slightly. Because letting billions die when we have the power to help would make us the monsters you always feared we were. Humanity has done terrible things in our history, Ambassador. We've fought brutal wars, committed atrocities, and caused suffering we can never undo. But we've also learned from those mistakes. We've learned that when someone asks for help, you give it, regardless of past grievances. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But I need you to understand something, Ambassador. The fleet that's coming is not what you're expecting. Human military doctrine is very different from coalition protocols. We don't fight with honor. We don't follow your rules of... 3 days after Ambassador Velnus returned to coalition space, the long-range sensors at Kalteri Station Prime detected something that made every operator freeze in shock. The signatures were unmistakable. Ships, lots of them, emerging from slipstream at the edge of their territory. High Admiral Seltros rushed to the sensor command center, his ceremonial robes flowing behind him. He had been in a strategy meeting with the remaining coalition fleet commanders, trying to plan a defense that everyone knew was hopeless. Now he stared at the display screen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How many?" he demanded. The sensor operator, a young Kalteri named Janice, checked her readings 3 times before answering. 47 distinct signatures, High Admiral. Mass readings indicate warships ranging from Corvette class to Dreadnought class. They match no known coalition designs. The humans, Seltros whispered. They actually came. But as more data came in, the shock in the command center grew. These were not the small peacekeeping vessels or diplomatic ships the coalition had imagined. These were warships built for one purpose and one purpose only. The energy signatures alone suggested weapon systems far beyond what coalition protocols allowed. The largest ship in the formation was massive, easily twice the size of any coalition dreadnought. Its hull was dark and angular, covered in what appeared to be armor plating thick enough to withstand direct hits from weapons that would vaporize most ships. Sensor arrays bristled from every surface, and the weapons ports. There were hundreds of them. "Open a channel," Seltros ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. The main screen flickered and a human woman appeared. She looked to be in her middle years, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight style, and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in a single glance. She wore a dark uniform with rank insignia that indicated high authority. "High Admiral Seltros," the woman said, her voice crisp and professional. "I am Fleet Admiral Linda Hayes of the United Earth Space Navy. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet is reporting for duty." Seltros bowed in the formal coalition manner. "Fleet Admiral Hayes, on behalf of the Kalteri Coalition, I welcome you and thank you for responding to our plea for assistance. We did not expect such a significant force." Linda's expression did not change. "When humanity commits to a mission, we commit fully, Admiral. I have reviewed all available data on the Vrek swarm. My fleet is prepared to engage immediately. I suggest we meet to coordinate our tactical approach." "Of course," Seltros said. "I will transmit coordinates for our command station. We can review our defensive strategies and integrate your forces into our formations." Something that might have been a smile briefly crossed Linda's face. "We can discuss that when I arrive. Hayes out." The screen went dark and Seltros stood in silence for a moment. Something about the human admiral's tone had been unsettling. She had not sounded like someone coming to reinforce a defensive position. She had sounded like someone arriving to take over. 2 hours later, a human shuttle docked at Kalteri Station Prime. Seltros waited in the main conference hall with his senior staff, all of them wearing their finest ceremonial uniforms. They wanted to show the humans that the coalition, despite their desperate circumstances, still maintained their dignity and traditions. Linda Hayes walked into the conference hall surrounded by her officers, and Seltros felt a moment of culture shock. The humans wore simple, practical uniforms with minimal decoration. They carried data pads and wore equipment belts with tools and devices. They looked like people ready to work, not to observe formalities. Linda wasted no time on pleasantries. "Admiral Seltros, I understand you have defensive plans prepared. I'd like to review them immediately." Seltros gestured to the holographic display at the center of the conference table. "Of course, Fleet Admiral. We have established a defensive perimeter around our 3 remaining core systems. Our strategy involves layered defenses, with heavy ships positioned to force the swarm into engagement zones where our lighter vessels can execute precision strikes." Linda studied the display, her expression unreadable. One of her officers, a man with dark skin and the rank insignia of a commander, leaned forward. "Admiral Seltros, what are your engagement protocols? How do you determine when to fall back?" "We calculate acceptable casualty rates based on tactical advantage gained," Seltros explained. "If losses exceed 30% of engaged forces, we conduct an organized retreat to secondary positions. This preserves fleet strength for future engagements." The human officers exchanged glances. Another officer, a woman with sharp features and the rank of captain, spoke up. "You're fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that can manufacture reinforcements faster than you can replace losses. That strategy guarantees defeat." Seltros felt defensive. "Captain, I assure you that our tactical doctrines have been refined over 3 centuries of military operations. We understand the principles of honorable warfare. Honorable warfare, Linda repeated, her tone flat. She looked directly at Seltros. Admiral, I respect your traditions and your military history, but your honorable warfare is why you're losing. The swarm does not care about honor. It does not calculate acceptable casualties. It simply overwhelms and consumes. She tapped the holographic display, and it changed to show new formations and movement patterns. This is how humanity fights. We do not establish static defensive positions. We maintain fluid formations that can concentrate force at critical points. We do not calculate acceptable casualties because we plan to achieve victory with minimal losses by being faster, more aggressive, and more unpredictable than the enemy. Seltros stared at the display. The human tactical formations looked chaotic, with ships spread across vast areas and movement patterns that seemed random. Fleet Admiral, forgive me, but these formations appeared dangerously dispersed. The swarm could isolate and destroy individual elements before support could arrive. Commander Ryan Pierce, the dark-skinned officer, stepped forward. That's what it will try to do, Admiral. And that's when we spring the trap. Human destroyers are fast and heavily armed. They draw enemy forces into pursuit. Then our heavy ships hit them from unexpected angles. We call it the Angry Hornet strategy. The what? Seltros asked, confused. Hornets, Ryan explained. Small flying creatures on Earth, very aggressive. They attack in swarms, and they're incredibly difficult to defend against because they don't follow predictable patterns. That's how my destroyer squadron operates. Seltros felt overwhelmed. Fleet Admiral Hayes, I am certain your tactics are effective in human military operations, but the Coalition fleet is not trained for such aggressive maneuvers. We cannot simply abandon our established doctrines. Linda's expression softened slightly. Admiral, I'm not asking you to abandon anything. What I'm suggesting is that you let my fleet handle the offensive operations while your forces provide support and cover evacuation routes. You've been fighting defensively for 3 months and losing ground every day. Let us try our way. But your casualties, Seltros protested. Your formations put individual ships at enormous risk. We don't do acceptable casualties, Linda said firmly. We do overwhelming violence delivered with precision and speed. Yes, our tactics look risky, but they work because human pilots and crews are trained to operate in conditions that would incapacitate most species. We can handle acceleration forces that would kill your personnel. We can make split-second decisions in combat situations that seem like chaos. This is what we evolved to do. Captain Jake Morrison, who had arrived with Linda's staff, spoke up. Hi, Admiral. Remember what I told you when I transmitted the fleet manifest? Human warfare is different. Trust us to do what we do best. Seltros looked around at his senior staff. They all seemed uncertain, frightened even. But what choice did they have? Their own strategies had failed completely. Perhaps it was time to let the Deathworlders show them another way. Very well, Fleet Admiral Hayes, Seltros said quietly. I will coordinate with my remaining fleet commanders. We will support your operations however we can. Excellent, Linda said. She tapped her datapad and transmitted files to Seltros. Here are the communication protocols, coordination frequencies, and emergency procedures. I want your ships equipped with human communication equipment within 24 hours. When the swarm arrives, we need to be able to coordinate perfectly. When the swarm arrives? Seltros asked. You sound certain they will attack soon? Linda's expression hardened. Admiral, the swarm has been consuming systems methodically, moving in a predictable pattern. Based on their progression, they will arrive at the Tertian system within 72 hours. That's where we will meet them. The Tertian system, Seltros said slowly. That system has 17 million civilians on 3 planets. We should evacuate them immediately. No, Linda said flatly. Evacuation would signal weakness and draw the swarm's attention. Instead, we position the fleet in the Tertian system and demonstrate that humanity is now involved in this war. We send a message that the easy harvesting is over. Seltros felt shock run through him. You would risk civilian lives to send a message? Linda met his eyes steadily. I would risk my fleet to protect civilian lives. There is a difference, Admiral. We are not using them as bait. We are. The Vrek swarm arrived in the Tertian system exactly 71 hours and 43 minutes after Fleet Admiral Linda Hayes had predicted. High Admiral Seltros, watching from his command ship positioned at the edge of the system, felt a chill run through him as the sensors detected the incoming signatures. 300,000 autonomous war machines, all emerging from slipstream in perfect coordination. The swarm did not form traditional battle formations. Instead, it spread across space like a dark cloud, each unit maintaining optimal distance from its neighbors, while the distributed intelligence coordinated their movements with inhuman precision. They're heading straight for the human positions, Janice reported from her sensor station, her voice tight with fear. Fleet Admiral Hayes placed her ships directly in their path. Celtro studied the tactical display. The human fleet looked tiny compared to the massive swarm force. 47 ships against 300,000. It seemed impossible, suicidal even. He opened a communication channel to the Valkyrie. Fleet Admiral Hayes, the swarm numbers are far worse than our estimates predicted. I strongly recommend we retreat to secondary positions and regroup. Linda's face appeared on the screen. She looked calm, almost relaxed. Recommendation noted and declined, Admiral. All ships execute maneuver Delta 7. Pierce, your destroyers are cleared to engage. The channel switched to a fleet-wide frequency, and Celtros heard Linda's voice echo across every human ship. This is Admiral Hayes to all vessels. The swarm has operated unopposed for 3 months. Today that ends. Show them what Deathworlders do when you threaten our territory. All ships weapons free. Execute. What happened next would be analyzed by military historians for decades, studied in tactical academies across Coalition space, and retold in stories that many would not believe. Commander Ryan Pierce's destroyer squadron, 17 ships that had been holding position in a loose formation, suddenly accelerated directly toward the incoming swarm. Not toward the edges where they might pick off stragglers, but straight into the center of the massive formation. The Coalition observers watched in horror as the human destroyers reached velocities that should have been impossible. The acceleration forces would kill any Coalition crew, turning their bodies into pulp against the walls of their ships. But human crews, evolved under Earth's crushing gravity, endured forces that would be lethal to most species. The destroyers hit the swarm formation like bullets punching through paper. They did not slow down or try to avoid the enemy vessels. Instead, they wove between the swarm units at speeds that made targeting nearly impossible, firing kinetic impactors at point-blank range. Kinetic weapons were considered primitive by Coalition standards, but watching them in action changed that perception. Tungsten rods accelerated to tremendous velocities, punched through swarm hulls like they were made of thin foil. Each impact released kinetic energy equivalent to a small nuclear device. Swarm units simply disintegrated, their remains spreading in clouds of debris that damaged other nearby units. How are they maneuvering like that? Celtros whispered, watching the tactical display in disbelief. The human destroyers twisted and turned through the swarm formation, their movements seeming almost random but devastatingly effective. Every time a swarm unit tried to target one destroyer, another appeared from an unexpected angle and destroyed it. They call it the Angry Hornet strategy, Jake Morrison said quietly. He had joined Celtros on the command ship to serve as liaison. Human pilots train in simulations that would be considered torture for most species. They learn to track multiple targets while under acceleration forces that impair cognitive function. It looks like chaos, but it's actually highly coordinated chaos. The swarm's distributed intelligence tried to adapt. It calculated optimal firing solutions, adjusted targeting priorities, attempted to predict human movement patterns. But human pilots did not follow algorithms. They relied on instinct, on split-second decisions made by brains that evolved to track fast-moving prey and avoid fast-moving predators. 17 destroyers created chaos among thousands of swarm units. And that was exactly what Linda Hayes had been waiting for. All heavy ships, execute Phase 2. Linda's voice echoed across the fleet channels. Let's show them what a Deathworld can build. The massive human warships that had been holding back in seeming vulnerability suddenly revealed their true purpose. These were not ships designed to trade fire with enemies at range. These were weapons platforms designed to deliver overwhelming violence in concentrated bursts. The UESN Valkyrie and her 2 sister dreadnoughts activated their nuclear-pumped laser arrays. Celtros had read about these weapons in the intelligence reports and had hoped the descriptions were exaggerated. They were not. Each dreadnought carried arrays of atomic warheads, small by nuclear weapon standards but still devastating. When activated, the warheads detonated in specially designed chambers, and the energy from the nuclear explosions was channeled through laser, focusing systems for a split second before the arrays themselves were destroyed by the blast. The Result was laser beams with power output measured in terawatts, lasting only microseconds but delivering enough energy to vaporize anything they touched. Each burst from the Valkyrie destroyed hundreds of swarm units in a single line cutting across space. The radiation from the nuclear detonations crippled thousands more. "They're using atomic weapons," Seltros said in shock. "In a conventional battle, that violates 6 different galactic conventions." "Human military doctrine does not recognize galactic conventions," Jake said quietly. "We fight to win, Admiral. Always." The swarm tried to respond to this new threat, redirecting thousands of units toward the human dreadnoughts. But Linda Hayes had anticipated that too. "Grant, your fighters are clear to engage. Show them why you're the best." From launching bays on the human carriers, fighter craft swarmed out like angry insects. These were not the large, well-protected coalition fighters that carried defensive shields and prioritized pilot safety. These were small, fast, and carried weapons that seemed too large for their frames. Lieutenant Sophie Grant led her wing directly into the swarm units converging on the dreadnoughts. Her voice came across the tactical channel, calm and focused despite flying at speeds that made coalition pilots physically ill just watching. "Red wing, hit their sensor clusters. Blue wing, target propulsion. Gold wing, you're with me. We're going for their command nodes." The coalition had not known the swarm had command nodes. Their analysis had suggested the distributed intelligence spread equally across all units. But the human fighters seemed to know exactly where to strike. They wove through point defense fire that filled space with enough ordnance to vaporize a small moon. Their movement so precise that it seemed impossible they were being controlled by biological beings. Sophie's targeting system locked onto a swarm unit that was larger than the others and emitting unusual energy signatures. "This one's mine," she said, and rolled her fighter through a series of maneuvers that would have torn a coalition fighter apart from the stress forces alone. She fired her entire missile load in a single salvo, then pulled up and away as the missiles streaked toward the target. The swarm unit's defenses destroyed 7 of the 8 missiles. The 8th got through and detonated directly against the unit's hull. The explosion was small, but the effect was not. Suddenly, hundreds of swarm units in the surrounding area began moving erratically, their coordination broken. The distributed intelligence had relied on those command nodes more than it had calculated, and losing even one created gaps in its coordination. "All fighters, target confirmed," Sophie called out. "Take out those big ones and the rest fall apart." Dr. Ben Carter watched the battle unfold from the medical bay of the UESN Mercy, his trauma team standing ready. He had expected heavy casualties from such an aggressive attack plan, but the tactical displays showed something remarkable. Human losses were minimal, just a handful of fighters damaged and no destroyers lost. The coalition observers could not understand it. How could a force so outnumbered, fighting with such reckless aggression, sustain so few casualties? The answer was simple. Humanity did not fight the way the swarm expected. Every calculation the distributed intelligence made was based on opponents who prioritized survival over aggression, who retreated when pressed, who followed predictable tactical doctrines. Humans did none of that. They charged when they should retreat. They took risks that seemed suicidal, but were actually calculated gambles based on human capabilities. They coordinated like a pack of predators, each element covering the others, adapting in real time to battlefield conditions. 4 hours after the battle began, the Vrek swarm did something that coalition military analysts had claimed was impossible. It retreated. The distributed intelligence calculated that destroying the human fleet would require resource expenditure exceeding acceptable parameters. Units were being lost at rates of thousands to one. The coordinated attack patterns were disrupted. The command nodes were being systematically eliminated. The swarm's programming, designed to ensure efficient resource utilization, determined that continued engagement was not optimal. News of the Tertian system battle spread across galactic networks like wildfire. Within hours, every coalition world knew about the human victory. Within days, species across the galaxy were analyzing the tactical data, watching recorded footage of the battle, and trying to understand what they had just witnessed. In the Coalition Council chambers, the 7 species representatives gathered for an emergency session. Ambassador Velness stood before them, feeling the weight of every eye upon him. He had brought humanity into coalition space, and now everyone wanted answers. 300,000 swarm units engaged. Counselor Theron of the Morthac species said, his voice trembling slightly. 40,000 destroyed in 4 hours. The humans suffered 11 casualties. 11. We have lost entire fleets with tens of thousands dead fighting forces a fraction of that size. The weapons they used, Counselor Sarix of the Venthari added, her membranous wings fluttering with agitation. Nuclear-pumped lasers deployed in conventional battle. Kinetic weapons traveling at relativistic speeds. Attack patterns that expose their pilots to radiation and acceleration forces that should be fatal. These are not the tactics of a civilized military. Ambassador Velnus listened to the concerns, many of them valid, before speaking. Counselors, I do not dispute that human military doctrine is shocking to our sensibilities. But they achieved in 4 hours what we could not achieve in 3 months. They stopped the swarm. They protected 17 million civilians who would have been harvested if we had relied on our own forces. At what cost to our principles? Counselor Theron demanded. We have built our alliance on the concept of honorable warfare, on respect for galactic conventions, on limiting casualties even among enemies. The humans threw all of that away and achieved total victory, Velnus countered. Counselors, I have spent time with Fleet Admiral Hayes and her staff. I have seen their planning, their training, their dedication. They are not monsters. They are simply different. They evolved on a world that demanded absolute excellence in survival, and they brought those skills to warfare. The debate continued for hours, but eventually a consensus emerged. The humans had proven their value as allies, regardless of how uncomfortable their methods made the coalition feel. More importantly, with the swarm still threatening dozens of systems, they needed humanity's help more than ever. High Admiral Seltros found himself in a similar meeting with coalition military commanders. The tactical analysis of the Tertian battle had revealed details that challenged everything the coalition military thought. They knew about warfare. The human destroyers operated with a 98% survival rate despite being directly engaged by thousands of swarm units, a Kalteri tactical analyst reported. They achieved this through constant motion, unpredictable maneuvers, and weapons deployment at ranges we would consider dangerously close. Their fighter pilots, another analyst added, looking at the data with disbelief, performed maneuvers that generate acceleration forces up to 12 times standard gravity. Coalition pilots black out at 6 times gravity. How are they not dead? Seltros knew the answer. He had read the briefing materials Jake Morrison had provided. They train for it. Human military pilots spend years conditioning their bodies to endure high-gravity maneuvers. They use special suits that help manage blood flow. And their brains, evolved on a high-gravity world, are better adapted to maintaining function under extreme conditions. It's not just physical capability, Jake Morrison said, joining the discussion via holographic link. It's tactical philosophy. Coalition doctrine focuses on minimizing friendly casualties through careful planning and measured responses. Human doctrine focuses on achieving victory so quickly and decisively that casualties become minimal as a result. We don't avoid risks. We manage them through superior training and overwhelming aggression. One of the coalition commanders, a Venthari named Corix, spoke up. Captain Morrison, there are reports that Fleet Admiral Hayes is planning another operation, something she calls Operation Hellhound. Can you explain this? Jake was quiet for a moment before responding. Admiral Hayes believes, and I agree, that defensive victories are not enough. The swarm is still out there, still building forces, still threatening coalition space. She wants to take the offensive. Offensive, Seltros said, leaning forward. Captain, the swarm controls dozens of systems. Any offensive operation would require penetrating deep into hostile territory, far beyond support or supply lines. The casualties would be catastrophic. You keep talking about casualties, Jake said, his tone patient but firm. Admiral Hayes has told you repeatedly that humanity does not accept casualties as inevitable. We plan to win with minimal losses because we fight smarter, faster, and more aggressively than our enemies can adapt to. But what is this Operation Hellhound? Corix pressed. Jake glanced at something off-screen, probably checking what information he was cleared to share. Admiral Hayes has identified the swarm's primary manufacturing facility. It's a massive orbital construction complex in the Kerrigan asteroid belt, deep in swarm-controlled space. Destroy that facility, and the swarm loses its ability to rebuild after losses. The operation will involve a direct assault on the most heavily defended location in swarm territory. The coalition commanders sat in stunned silence. What Hayes was proposing was not just aggressive, it was suicide. The swarm would have concentrated its defenses around such a critical facility. Any attacking force would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. How many ships is Admiral Hayes requesting for this operation? Seltros asked carefully. She's not requesting any, Jake said. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet will execute the operation with or without Coalition support. However, she would appreciate Coalition vessels providing screening support and securing evacuation routes for any civilian populations in nearby systems. She intends to attack alone? Seltros said in disbelief. Alone is how humanity prefers to operate in high-risk situations, Jake explained. We take risks with our own people, not with allies who train and fight differently. If Coalition forces want to observe or provide support, that's welcome. But the primary assault will be executed by human forces using human tactics. After the meeting ended, Seltros sat alone in his office, reviewing tactical projections for Operation Hellhound. Even with the most optimistic estimates, the operation showed human casualties in the thousands. The swarm would defend its manufacturing facility with everything it had. No amount of aggressive tactics could overcome such overwhelming numbers. But then he remembered watching the Tertian system battle. Remembered seeing 17 destroyers create chaos among thousands of enemy units. Remembered fighters weaving through defensive fire that should have vaporized them. Remembered the swarm, an enemy that had seemed unstoppable, retreating in the face of human aggression. Maybe, just maybe, the humans knew something the Coalition did not. Across Coalition space, the reaction to news of the battle was mixed. Civilian populations celebrated, grateful that humanity had stopped the swarm's advance. But military leaders and political officials felt deep unease. Humanity had demonstrated capabilities that challenged the galactic balance of power. Several species that had maintained neutral positions during the swarm crisis suddenly opened diplomatic channels with humanity. Others reinforced their borders and increased military readiness, not because they feared the swarm, but because they feared what humanity might do with this newfound influence. The Venthari Concordat, a powerful but cautious species, sent observers to meet with Linda Hayes. Their senior military advisor, Commander Kelris, arrived on the Valkyrie with questions that had been carefully prepared by his government. Linda received him in her ready room, a simple office with minimal decoration and several tactical displays showing fleet dispositions. Commander Kelris, welcome aboard. How can I help you? Kelris settled into the chair provided, his wings folding carefully against his back. Admiral Hayes, my government has reviewed the tactical data from Tertian system. We are impressed by your victory, but also concerned by your methods. The deployment of atomic weapons in conventional battle violates established protocols. Commander, Linda said calmly, humanity is not signatory to most galactic conventions. We joined the galactic community relatively recently, and frankly, many of those conventions seem designed to prolong conflicts rather than end them decisively. Human history taught us that long wars cause more suffering than short, brutal ones. But the casualties, Kelris protested. Your tactics expose your personnel to conditions that seem inhumane. Linda's expression hardened slightly. Every human in my fleet volunteered for service. They trained for years to be able to operate in conditions that would kill most species. They understand the risks, and they accept them because they believe in the mission. That's not inhumane, Commander. That's dedication. She pulled up a holographic display showing casualty statistics. In 3 months, the Coalition lost over 400,000 military personnel fighting the swarm. In 4 hours, my fleet destroyed 40,000 swarm units and lost 11 people. Which approach is more humane? Kelris had no answer for that. He shifted to his next question. The 3rd Expeditionary Fleet dropped out of slipstream at the edge of the Kerrigan asteroid belt, and every sensor on every ship immediately lit up with threat warnings. The swarm's manufacturing facility sat in the center of the belt, a massive complex of orbital structures that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of space. Around it, like an angry swarm of insects, 50,000 defensive platforms waited. On the bridge of the Valkyrie, Linda Hayes studied the tactical display with the calm expression of someone who had expected exactly this situation. Sensor analysis confirms Captain Morgan's reconnaissance data. The facility matches predicted specifications. All ships prepare for Phase 1 assault. High Admiral Seltros watched from his command ship. positioned safely at the system's edge with the Coalition observer fleet. He had argued against this operation, had pleaded with Linda to reconsider, had offered every logical reason why a direct assault would fail. She had listened politely and ignored every suggestion. Now he watched as Commander Ryan Pierce's destroyer squadron accelerated toward the defensive perimeter at velocities that made Coalition sensors struggle to track them. "This is madness," he whispered. "They're flying directly into the teeth of the heaviest defenses in swarm territory." Jake Morrison stood beside him, watching the tactical display with an expression of fierce pride. "Admiral, have you ever seen a wolf pack hunt? They don't sneak around the prey. They charge directly at it, coordinating their attack to hit from multiple angles simultaneously. That's what you're about to witness." The 17 destroyers hit the defensive perimeter like hammers striking glass. They did not slow down or attempt evasive maneuvers. Instead, they accelerated harder, weaving between defensive platforms while firing everything they had. Kinetic impactors, missiles, and energy weapons created a storm of destruction, but this time the swarm was ready. It had analyzed the Tertian system battle, had adapted its targeting algorithms, had positioned defenses specifically to counter human aggressive tactics. Defensive fire filled space with such density that it seemed impossible for anything to survive. Ryan's voice came across the tactical channel, steady despite the chaos surrounding his ship. "All destroyers execute scatter pattern Omega. Make them work for every shot. Valkyrie, the hole is opening. Bring the heavy ships through." 3 destroyers took hits, their shields flaring and hulls breaching, but even damaged, they continued fighting. Their crews working with practiced efficiency to manage damage and maintain weapons fire. The human doctrine of cross-training meant that when positions were lost, others could step in immediately. "Phase 2, execute now," Linda ordered. The Valkyrie and her sister dreadnoughts, using the chaos created by the destroyer assault, pushed through the defensive perimeter. The swarm shifted to target these larger, more dangerous vessels, and that was exactly what Linda wanted. "Lieutenant Grant, your fighters are clear to launch. Hit those command nodes hard." Sophie Grant had been waiting for this moment. Her fighter wing launched from their carriers and immediately scattered into dozens of different vectors, each pilot flying an unpredictable path toward the manufacturing facility. The swarm's targeting systems tried to calculate intercept solutions, but human pilots made decisions based on instinct and split-second reactions rather than algorithms. "Goldwing, I've got a lock on command node Alpha," Sophie called out, rolling her fighter through a series of maneuvers that would have torn the wings off any Coalition craft. "Blue Wing, take the secondary nodes. Red Wing, cover our approach." The point defense fire was even heavier than at Tertian system, but Sophie had trained for this. She had spent thousands of hours in simulators, flying through defensive fire, learning to read the patterns to see the gaps that existed for microseconds. Her fighter twisted through the barrage like a leaf in a storm, seeming to move by pure luck, but actually following paths calculated by a human brain processing information faster than any computer. Her missiles launched, streaking toward the command node. The swarm destroyed 6 of the 8, but 2 got through, and that was enough. The command node exploded, and suddenly hundreds of defensive platforms nearby began firing erratically, their coordination disrupted. Dr. Ben Carter worked in the medical bay of the UESN Mercy, as wounded pilots and crew were brought in. The injuries were severe, the kind of trauma that would kill most species. But human bodies, evolved to survive on a death world, endured. Broken bones were set and sealed. Burns were treated with synthetic skin. Blood loss was managed with transfusions and synthetic plasma. "How many casualties?" Linda asked over the command channel. 372 wounded, 43 critical, Ben reported, his hands steady as he worked on a pilot who had taken shrapnel through his chest. "We've lost 97 so far, mostly from the destroyers that took direct hits. But Admiral, we're saving people who by all rights should be dead. Human resilience is keeping the casualty count lower than projected." "Understood. Keep doing what you do, Doctor. We're almost through their defenses." The battle raged for 18 hours, a brutal grinding fight that tested every aspect of human military capability. The swarm adapted continuously, adjusting tactics, redirecting forces, attempting to overwhelm human ships through sheer numbers. But humanity adapted faster. When the swarm concentrated fire on the destroyers, they scattered. When it tried to surround the dreadnoughts, the fighters hit from unexpected angles. When it attempted to predict human movements, the pilots changed their patterns. It was like trying to catch smoke with your hands. Linda watched the tactical display, reading the flow of battle like a chess master seeing 20 moves ahead. The swarm is committing its reserves to defend the southern approach. Commander Pierce, pull your destroyers back and reposition to the north. Make them think we're retreating, then hit them where they're weakest. Ryan acknowledged, and his squadron executed a fighting retreat that drew swarm forces after them. The moment the swarm committed to pursuit, the destroyers reversed course and charged back through the gap they had created, emerging behind the defensive lines. Target the facility's power generation nodes, Linda ordered. I want that complex dark and helpless in the next 30 minutes. The Valkyrie positioned itself for the final strike. The nuclear-pumped laser arrays were ready, but Linda had something else in mind for this target. She had brought a weapon that humanity had developed centuries ago and never stopped perfecting. All ships clear the firing solution, deploying kinetic orbital bombardment system. From the Valkyrie's weapons bay, tungsten rods began launching. They were simple weapons, just extremely dense metal rods, but they were accelerated to relativistic speeds by magnetic launch systems. When something that heavy hit something else at near light speed, the physics became devastating. The first rod hit the manufacturing facility's central power core. The kinetic energy release was equivalent to a small nuclear weapon, but without the radiation. The structure simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the impact. Secondary explosions rippled through the complex as power systems overloaded and containment fields collapsed. Target the manufacturing bays, Linda said calmly. I want nothing left that can build swarm units. 12 more rods launched, each one striking a different section of the facility. The massive orbital complex, which had been producing thousands of swarm units daily, began breaking apart. Atmosphere vented into space. Construction equipment melted under the heat of secondary explosions. Manufacturing bays collapsed as structural supports failed. The swarm's distributed intelligence recognized the catastrophic damage and made a decision. The manufacturing facility could not be saved. Resources needed to be preserved for future operations. It ordered a retreat. Sophie Grant watched swarm units beginning to withdraw and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. All fighters pursue and eliminate. Don't let them regroup. The human fighters chased the retreating swarm units, destroying them with precision fire. Coalition observers watching from safety could barely believe what they were seeing. A force that had seemed invincible was fleeing from a smaller human fleet. All ships cease fire, Linda ordered. Let them run. Our objective was to destroy the manufacturing facility, and that objective is achieved. Pursuing scattered units is not worth additional casualties. The battle ended not with a climactic final fight, but with the swarm fleeing and humanity standing victorious among the wreckage of the galaxy's most advanced manufacturing facility. The debris field would drift in space for centuries, a testament to what happened when you threatened a species of persistence predators. High Admiral Seltros stared at the tactical display in silence. The human fleet had penetrated the most heavily defended location in swarm territory, destroyed a facility that produced thousands of war machines daily, and achieved total victory. The casualties were higher than a Tertian system, but still remarkably low considering the opposition faced. They did it, Seltros said quietly. They actually did it, Jake Morrison nodded. Humanity does not commit to operations we cannot win, Admiral. When we say we will do something, we do it, no matter what it takes. Over the next 3 days, the full extent of the swarm's defeat became clear. Without its primary manufacturing facility, the distributed,